You're home alone, half watching something on your laptop, half listening to the house. A door creaks somewhere down the hall, probably just the heat kicking on. Still, your arms go cold. The hair on them lifts, every strand standing at attention, like it's bracing for something you haven't even identified yet. Your body just activated a defense system built for an animal. You stopped being 65 million years ago. This video is about piloerection, the reflex that raises your hair when you're afraid, and why your skin still runs code written for a creature with fur, muscle, and a much thicker coat than you'll ever have again. And by the end, you'll understand why fear doesn't just live in your head. It runs a physical program your brain can't override, no matter how modern, safe, or well-lit your world becomes. Piloerection starts with a muscle you've never consciously moved and probably never knew you had. Each hair follicle on your body has a tiny bundle of smooth muscle fibers attached to its base, called the erector pili. Charles Darwin was one of the first to document the reflex scientifically, describing it in his 1872 book on emotional expression, where he connected human goosebumps directly to the fur-raising response he observed in startled and threatened animals. When adrenaline floods your bloodstream, it triggers these muscles to contract in unison, pulling each hair upright at the root. In a fur-covered mammal, that single mechanical action does two jobs at once. It traps a thick layer of air close to the skin as insulation against sudden cold, and it makes the animal's silhouette larger. A frightened cat doesn't grow more fur the instant it's startled. It simply stands every hair it already has on end, and the illusion of size is often enough to make a predator think twice. Here's the part that should stop you. You don't have nearly enough hair for either function to work anymore. Humans actually carry roughly the same number of hair follicles as a chimpanzee spread across their body, somewhere in the range of 5 million. But the overwhelming majority of ours grow hair so fine, so short and so thin that it traps no meaningful air and adds no visible size to anything. The muscles still work exactly as designed. The material they're working with just isn't there anymore. But here's where it gets interesting. Your body never got the memo that the hardware changed. Research published in the journal Neuroscience has tracked how the exact same sympathetic nervous system pathway responsible for your fight or flight response directly innervates those erector pili muscles. This isn't a separate fear reaction bolted on afterward. It's wired into the identical circuit that speeds up your heartbeat and dries out your mouth. Scientists estimate that roughly 1/5 of a second is all it takes from the moment your brain registers a potential threat to the moment the hair on your arm is standing fully upright. You often feel calm, or at least composed, in the same instant it's happening, because the reflex runs faster than conscious thought can catch up to it. That speed is the entire point. This isn't a reflex your brain has time to approve or veto. It fires before you've consciously labeled what scared you, which is exactly why a creak in an empty house can trigger a full physiological alarm before your rational mind gets a vote. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone's alarm system is wired at the same sensitivity. Dermatologists have long noted that the strength of a person's piloerection response varies with the density and thickness of their hair follicles, meaning two people can experience the identical jolt of fear and produce visibly different amounts of raised skin. One person's arms turning to a field of tight bumps, another barely reacting at all. A 2022 review in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology noted that follicle density can vary by a factor of 2 or more between individuals on the same patch of forearm skin, which means the visible proof of fear you see on your own arm was never a reliable measure of how afraid you actually are. Some people are quietly terrified with almost no goosebumps to show for it. Others get chills from something mild and look, on the surface, like they've seen a ghost. That's a strange kind of unfairness built into a reflex that's supposed to be universal. But here's where it gets interesting. The same reflex fires for reasons that have nothing to do with danger at all. A study out of the University of Melbourne examined what researchers actually call Skin. Orgasms. The clinical term for the chills people get from music, and found that somewhere between a quarter and half of people experience piloerection during a particularly powerful piece of music, often triggered by an unexpected chord change or a sudden swell in volume after a quiet passage. Brain imaging work in the same body of research shows the regions activated during these musical chills overlap heavily with the reward circuitry lit up by food, sex, and drugs. Your skin, in other words, cannot tell the difference between a predator in the dark and a chorus landing exactly where you hoped it would. That's strange enough to sit with for a second. The same muscle contraction meant to save your life from a wolf is also what happens when a song does something you didn't expect. But here's where it gets interesting. This reflex isn't limited to fear or musical beauty either. It shows up during grief, during nostalgia when an old photo surfaces without warning, during awe at something vast like a night sky far from any city, and even during pride when someone you love succeeds at something that mattered to them. Researchers increasingly treat piloerection less as a fear-specific response and more as a general marker of emotional intensity, one that fires regardless of whether the underlying emotion feels good or bad. But here's where it gets interesting. There's also a temperature layer to this reflex that gets overlooked entirely. The erector pili muscles responsible for fear-based goosebumps are the exact same ones responsible for ordinary cold weather goosebumps. Your body uses a single mechanical tool for two completely different emergencies, physical cold and emotional threat, because evolution rarely builds a brand new part when an old one can simply be repurposed. That's why a chill down your spine during a scary story and a chill from stepping outside in winter can feel almost identical on the skin, even though your brain is processing two entirely different categories of alarm underneath the surface. There isn't a dedicated fear nerve running to your skin. There's one general-purpose alarm muscle, reused for whatever crisis shows up first. But here's where it gets interesting. Animals that still rely on this reflex for its original purpose show us exactly what humans have lost. A frightened porcupine doesn't just look bigger when its quills rise, it becomes genuinely more dangerous to touch, since raised quills lock into a position that makes them easier to drive into an attacker. A startled cat's tail, thanks to the same erector pili contraction, can visibly double in width in under a second, an effect biologists call piloerection-driven silhouette expansion. Dogs do something similar along the ridge of their spine when they feel threatened, which is where the phrase raising hackles comes from, a term that started as a literal description of a dog's fur and slowly became a metaphor for any rising tension between people. Our version of the same reflex produces nothing but a faint texture on bare skin, a vestigial echo of a warning system that once had real, physical teeth behind it. The late pivot is this. Goosebumps might be one of the last physical proofs that your body doesn't fully trust your mind's interpretation of an event. You can know, rationally, with total certainty, that the creak in the hallway is the heating system settling into the walls. Your erector pili muscles don't check with you first. They act on threat probability, not threat certainty, which means this reflex evolved to protect a much hairier, much more vulnerable ancestor. Still treats maybe exactly the same way it treats definitely, and there's a quieter, colder wrinkle underneath that. Some researchers have proposed that persistent, chronic stress can leave the sympathetic nervous system in a state of heightened baseline readiness, essentially stuck partway toward alarm even when nothing is actively wrong. That would mean people carrying long-term anxiety may find their bodies reacting to small, harmless stimuli with the same intensity once reserved for genuine danger. The reflex that made perfect sense for a creature dodging predators in open grassland can, in a modern nervous system kept under constant low-grade alert, start firing at almost nothing. A text left unanswered too long, a shift in someone's tone of voice, a silence that stretches a beat too far. There's no wolf in any of those moments. There's no genuine physical threat anywhere nearby. But the erector pili muscles don't grade threats on a curve, and they were never designed to distinguish between a predator crouched in tall grass and an ordinary, forgettable Tuesday that simply felt slightly off. The reflex only knows two settings: fire or don't fire, and a nervous system trained by repetition. To expect danger will keep choosing fire, long after the actual danger has passed or never existed in the first place. In that sense, goosebumps aren't just a leftover from prehistory. For some people, they're a running record of exactly how safe their body currently believes them to be, whether or not that belief lines up with reality. You're still on the couch.